Welcome everyone to M&M Chat, the talk show where I bring people in from the tabletop role-playing community and ask them questions about the things that they make, be it their content that they release or the worlds that they build, the games that they play, and overall just give people a space to nerd out for a little bit and not feel guilty about it. So today I have with me NeverNotDM, at least that's their Twitter handle. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself, let the world know what you do?
Hi everybody, my name is NeverNotDM, or Ben, on Twitter, and I am a tabletop RPG player, world builder, and most importantly, DM, who loves making content for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
And how true is that handle? Do you really never get to play?
It started off as a bit of a meme, and then it became a truth pretty rapidly in my tabletop RPG career. The instant I sat down and played D&D, I knew that I wanted to be a dungeon master. I was like, that is what I want to do. And then eventually, my friends and I finished the games that they were DMing, and I started DMing, and I just kind of always ended up being the dungeon master. So it is mostly true. I do occasionally get to play, very, very, very rarely, but almost all of the time I am the dungeon master.
Yeah, well, being a player reminds you that you like DMing more, or at least that's how it always works for me.
Yeah, that is how it is for me as well. I enjoy playing, but I don't even think I'm a particularly great Dungeons & Dragons player. I think I'm a much better DM than I am a player, so I'm a lot more comfortable in the driver's seat of most campaigns.
I guess it's good to at least know that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a bad D&D player. I just don't think I'm as good as I am DMing. I'm not an incredible player, so I'm happy DMing.
Well, what got you into Dungeons & Dragons in the first place?
Well, I've always kind of had a backseat interest into Dungeons & Dragons. I'd heard about it when I was in high school, so I actually used to be a competitive Magic the Gathering player. I played on the Pro Tour. I have a Grand Prix top 8. I used to travel across the country for almost a year and a half playing competitive Magic. And before that, I played Magic for almost 8 years. So the Magic the Gathering and D&D scenes have always been pretty intertwined. I spent a lot of my middle school and high school years in hobby shops. And in those hobby shops, there would always be people playing D&D. So I was always pretty curious about it, but I never had a group, never had anything to do. And then I got really burned out on competitive Magic. It was very difficult to keep up the grind, traveling 8+ hour drives every other weekend. And so I stopped playing, and I really didn't see my friends as much because almost all of my friends came through competitive Magic, and I stopped playing. So I was kind of lonely and looking for something to do, and I was working at Barnes & Noble at the time as a part-time summer job, and this girl came in, and she was looking for a Dungeons & Dragons book, and we started talking, and she said that she was a member of the local gaming club at my university that I didn't even know existed. And I told my girlfriend about it, and she's like, well, you should join that club and try to find a D&D game. I mean, you're looking for for friends, you want something to do, why don't you go join the club? And so I did, and funnily enough, that girl, Emma, was actually my first dungeon master ever. The first D&D campaign I ever played was with her, and we didn't even know at the time. We met over Discord, at the club's Discord, and then I showed up to the campaign, and I was like, I know you were in Barnes & Noble, and she's like, I recognize you too, so it was just a funny kind of coincidence.
Well, that's great. And then from there, I mean, just immediately got hooked and into it?
Oh, yeah. I would say after about 2 sessions, I was like, this is my new thing. And I knew, basically after the first session, I was like, I want to be a dungeon master. That's what I want to do in this space. And so since then, I started planning my first campaign halfway into that semester of college, and I started running it the next semester. And It was awesome. I had a really, really great time running my first campaign. It actually just ended in April of this year. So I actually ended a D&D campaign. It was very bittersweet that it was my first one that I'd ever really started and then finished. We played like some smaller modules in between. Like we play on 2 nights a week and we played Curse of Strahd for a bit, but this was one we actually like truly finished, did the whole story. It was really great to do something like that.
And was it your own homebrew campaign, or was it a module?
It was my own homebrewed world, homebrewed campaign. I would say personally that I regret starting out my first DMing experience building my own world. I definitely think that the guidance of a module would have been really helpful when I was starting out, and there were a lot of mistakes and stuff that I made that, having now DM'd a module, I felt like would have helped me a lot better. Not that running modules is necessarily easier, but it gives more support for a new dungeon master. So I think I would try that again.
Can you think of what some of those issues might have been jumping straight into homebrew?
I think the real issue was, as a first-time DM, not only was I having to balance, create encounters, I was also having to create maps, create loot, create lore, create situations, and it just became so much to juggle, especially at first, that while I was still learning the mechanics of DMing, it's a lot easier when you don't have other things to worry about.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you're like actually at the table or online, either way. But the pressure of having to keep all of those things straight, I could see wanting to kind of lean back onto the pre-written module, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I really had a good time DMing Curse of Strahd. I thought it was a good module. I haven't actually ever DM'd another module. I've ran like 1 or 2 things out of Candlekeep Mysteries, but for the most part, I do make my own worlds and my own campaigns within that world, and most of my content is stuff that I built for my worlds that I have polished to put out there for an audience.
Sure, that makes sense. And so, how long then have you been DMing?
I've been DMing for about 2.5 years at this point.
Okay, so in that time, it sounds like have you been in the same world for this main campaign?
I was in the same world for the main campaign, and that campaign lasted about almost 2 years, because we had some time off during summers and stuff because we were college students. So we played for about 2 years, and it was a really good campaign, but I've also did some other stuff in some other worlds. I have 3 main worlds that I've worked on. The one where I played my first homebrew campaign, which is Alteria, which is a high fantasy world where the tagline is "The gods are dead." So it's a godless world where the characters are exploring the consequences of a society without gods. I have another world called Aetherguard, which is sci-fi steampunk western, and the goal with Aetherguard is to have ridiculous pulp action. And it's all about stuff like having battles atop moving trains, heists, gangs, airship battles. It's just supposed to be a world where ridiculous things are possible. And then the world that I'm currently running a campaign in is called Syndra. And that is a low magic, heavy politics campaign where my players are exploring the downfall of an empire. So the Empire of Syndra conquered the entire world about 500 years ago. And since then, it's been the golden age of Syndra, the Pax Syndra. But now that empire that was built on conquest has nothing left to conquer. And it's about the decline of an empire and the social, political, and economic consequences of this great and glorious empire starting to crumble. And the characters can't necessarily save the empire. There really is no saving the empire. But how they direct the fall of the Empire, how their actions are going to play into how many pieces does it break into, is the story we're exploring in that world.
Wow, that sounds actually really, really interesting. And I definitely resonate with the idea of a low magic, high politics campaign world, because that's basically what I've got going on with mine. So that sounds awesome. Now, with that idea of a empire that's crumbling slowly, it sounds like, I guess, what are some ways that you've had your players affect that?
So right now, the players are getting involved in several kind of different plot threads. So they started off in this small town of Monarch Hill. They were invited to the wedding. Some of them got there legitimately, others forged their invitations, and they started off at this rehearsal dinner. And this wedding was between a lord called Lord Castilla and his son, and then the daughter of a mining corporation baron. So the daughter of a fairly wealthy emerald mining corporation and the son of a moderately powerful farming lord were getting married. And the reason why it was important was because they were both Cordovan. So this empire has various provinces and regions. It has 14 of them, and Cordova is the biggest and most prosperous, but it's also currently not under the control of Cordovans. They tried to rebel against the crown about 40 years ago. They lost, and the family that ruled Cordova for basically 1,500 years, all of them were slaughtered. And so the Cordovan people are still, almost 40 years later, very discontent with the government. And so the alliance of two powerful Cordovan factions is a pretty big deal politically. And there was mayhem and chaos at this wedding. There's fae magic that's getting involved. There's conflict with the Inquisitors, who are an anti-magic sect of the Empire that is legitimized by the Path of the Seven. And then we've got the local politics. So it's on a grand scale, there's rebels, people just trying to do the right thing in a crumbling world, fae magic that's becoming more confrontational with the mortals, and they're exploring the impact of that. So they're kind of deciding what side do they want to stand on. Do they want to stand with the authorities? Do they want to work with Lord Castile, who's a fairly decent fellow as far as they can tell? Or do they want to side with the rebellion? Or do they want to investigate this fae folk magic that seems to be attacking all of the parties, the rebels, the bandits, the Empire? So I'm basically leaving it up to them to decide how do they want to change the course of history? Do they want the Cordovan rebellion to succeed? Do they want the Empire to crush the rebellion and lead to further discontent in the future? Do they want to stay out of all of that and then try to investigate this whole separate fae magic arc that's going on? So my goal in this kind of campaign is not to box them into one side, but to let their actions decide what forces they're going to support in the coming conflicts.
Yeah, and you weren't kidding when you said you've got a lot of different threads out there for players to chase, and that's such a great setup. I love just throwing things out there and seeing which ones the players grab onto. Now, have you spent a lot of time building up this world, or is this just like stuff you're making up on the fly? Because 2.5 years, it sounds like there is some, or I guess 2-ish years you've been actually building this world out, and it sounds like there's some real deep lore there.
I am the kind of world builder who does go very deep into world building. I want to stress to DMs that it's about creating situations, not solutions, and being a good DM isn't about planning for every single thing, but setting up potential plot points. So as a DM, I don't have 5 arcs from now planned out, but in order to improv really well, what I do personally is I create really deep lore. So I know the lore of my world really well, and therefore will know kind of what to implement and how my NPCs and stuff are going to react. So I put a lot of detail into the base of the world, like the culture, the different political factions, the history, the religions, and then I use that as a way to improvise better. So I don't normally create lore up on the fly, but I do create situations up on the fly or NPCs up on the fly, and I can do that because I can lean on my lore as, I wouldn't say a crutch because that's not the right word, but as a support. So for me, I'm a deep lore guy. I have lots of lore, lots of world stuff. I understand how the politics and the economies of my various provinces all interact with each other. And if you're going to do what I do or take my strategy, what I would encourage any DMs listening is you have to be okay if the players don't experience everything you've created. You have to be able to create for yourself and to create for the purpose of being able to pull on that later in the campaign. But you have to be okay with the fact that your players aren't going to experience everything that you've written. And you don't want to create like every shop in every town or every NPC that they could ever have. But if you understand, well, the town they're going to is called Peach Grove. So it's called Peach Grove. Why? Well, they grow peaches. So what's the economy of this place like? Well, it's going to be probably an orchard-based town. There's going to be landlords who own the peaches and then people who pick the peaches. And then from there, I can kind of create, what would be in that town, what kind of situations could they run into. And so I didn't really create anything about this town other than a name and the fact that they grow peaches. But from my lore and from my understanding of like how this town is placed and where this town is, I can create a lot of stuff for that town up on the fly.
Right. Right, and I love that point you make of you have to be okay with players not getting every bit that you put into it. It has to be for yourself a little bit. I know there's been at least one or two times, but I was thinking of it even this morning. I set up this this statue basically out in the middle of the wilderness that my players came across, and on it was a prophecy written in the Halfling language, and none of my players knew Halfling. And they didn't do really anything. I think they got an etching of it, or they did a rub of the words so that they could translate it later. And they absolutely never did. They just completely forgot about it. Totally fine. I am not upset that they've missed out on this prophecy. But I know in the future, if I want to pull something out, there's this massive lore bomb that's just kind of sitting in their pockets that I have made. And even if these characters don't interact with it, maybe I use it 2 years from now. And that's half the fun, is just knowing that it's there.
Oh, yeah. And, I bet they had a good time investigating that statue and coming up with a solution, and there was some good role play, and none of us speak Halfling. Okay, well, what does that mean for our backstories? And where does that mean we're from? And so there's a lot of stuff that even if they don't get the lore out of this random statue that you put in the middle of the woods, they still probably had a good time. And at the end, that's what matters, is that everybody has a good time playing the game. So...
Exactly. Now, are all of your worlds that you've created this in depth, or is it just the main one that you've built up such a solid foundation around?
I would say that two of my worlds, so Alteria was the world I had that long, almost 2-year campaign in, and then Syndra is the world that I created for the podcast, the Eldritch Cast, which you can still listen to the first 4 episodes of. We had our very first arc, but we ended up not being able to continue. Editing was too much for people who were still in college. But I would say Alteria and Syndra, two of my worlds, are really, really built up. Aetherguard has a bit less lore. It's not really as in-depth, it's a lot less, but that's because the world of Aetherguard is absolutely immense. There's, thousands of planets in this world, and there's travel between them, and tons of different government factions. So it's not really about the world building necessarily as it is about the themes of pulp action and space western and tying into that there's no such thing as a good guy mentality that I love about shows like Firefly or Cowboy Bebop, where our heroes are bounty hunters or criminals. And so that's the kind of games that I play in Aetherguard. Is it's not necessarily about backstory. It's mostly one-shots or very short series where the goal is to do crazy pulp action stuff, like rob a train while it's moving, or do some kind of assassination attempt while they're in a giant blimp and you guys need to blow up the blimp to kill the senator and stuff like that. Like, the goal of that world is to be absolutely and completely outlandish. And so it's not really about the super specific world building. It's about just setting the tone. Like, we are playing this world. The goal is, like, whenever anyone plays in my Aetherguard world, I tell them the goal is to be as ridiculous as possible. We had one guy who played a wizard, and his wizard got all of his magic from drugs. He drugged himself up to use different spells, and he would only talk through his familiar, which was a rat. So the rat would talk, he would talk in a rat voice and just used a bunch of drugs, and they stumble across this girl who's been kidnapped, but they didn't know it was a girl, they thought it was just a piece of luggage. And he knocks her out. His Toll the Dead was... He had all these really cool descriptions for different drugs that he was using on himself to, like, cast Fireball or fly. And then Toll the Dead was he literally just hit somebody with a metal bell. And so he just knocked this little girl out. And he was like, I can't smoke this! And so that's what I want in Aetherguard, is that tone.
Right. I think when you first described it to me, my initial thought was, that sounds great for one-shots.
It is a one-shot or short series world. It's not meant to be something that you'd explore for 2 years. It's something that you come into, and it's like, we've got a heist. And then I've just got the building set up, and you guys have to figure out how to break in.
Yeah, that's awesome. I need to steal that. At least that concept. Great. So one of the things that I'm definitely seeing as a pattern here is you have no shortage of ideas. Now, I know that you homebrew some actual material that you release to the world. Talk to me about that. How did you get into homebrewing actual, things to put out and sell to people?
I think it's the story for a lot of people who have been in the same position. You're a dungeon master, you want to create a cool monster, but there's not one in the monster manual, so then I made up a stat block. I was really disappointed with the magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide, so I made my own magic items. And my players were like, wow, these items are really cool. And I thought about them and I was like, wow, this was really fun to design all of this extra content for my games and to be able to share that with my players. And eventually I was like, well, I'm doing all of this work on creating all of this stuff. Why don't I try to put it out there? And that's when I started releasing some stuff on DM's Guild. I did my first release with an awesome creator, Danny, Dungeons and Dans on Twitter. And we created this monster stat block for the Yuki Onna and a Warlock subclass. So I did the most of the design on the subclass, and he did a lot of the design on the monster. And then we released it together on DM's Guild, and that's still available for free on DM's Guild. And it was just a really positive reception, really enjoyed that process, and so I just started creating more. I've always been into homebrewing subclasses, so I started releasing some subclasses on Twitter. And I got a really positive reception, so I thought, why don't I put them on DM's Guild and see if people want to buy them? And, people have wanted to buy them. So that's been really great. And that's kind of how it all started.
It is always good when people actually, enjoy the things you create, right?
It is. It's a really nice feeling. I want to stress to people that DM's Guild doesn't let you leave reviews instantly. You have to wait 24 hours. And because of that, a lot of people never go back and review things, even though they really liked them. So I really want to stress to anybody who's purchased anything on DM's Guild, leaving a review means the world to a creator. You know, no one wants a negative review, but just getting reviews on there is really difficult. So it's really important to us to get great feedback.
Yeah, and that's something that I think goes for just creators as a whole in this space, not even just like the TTRPG space, but I'll just say the indie scene, is that it can be very difficult to get actual feedback that is more than either, you know, hey, this sucks, which is obviously not helpful, or this is good, which also doesn't really help. Like getting legitimate constructive feedback, you know, it's, oh, okay, you gave a 4-star review, but they pointed out a lot of things that could actually be done better and had a lot of, you know, unique takes around that. I mean, hey, you want the 5-star, but just sometimes getting any feedback like that is worth a whole lot more than the dopamine hit from the number.
Oh, yeah. Feedback is so vital to the development process. And I love Tabletop RPG Twitter and the Tabletop RPG community. It's a really, really supportive community. And I've been a part of Twitter communities, Magic the Gathering Twitter, that are incredibly toxic. Magic the Gathering Twitter is horrible. Sorry for any of you who are on it. Like, I'm legitimately sorry for you because it's a cesspool.
For some reason, I'm not surprised. Magic the Gathering has so much of a focus on, well, I don't know. I won't get into my experiences with Magic, but it's a scary place to me.
I've met a lot of amazing people through it, but the Twitterscape is really hellish. But to kind of bring back what we were talking about,
yeah,
in the tabletop RPG space, we're really positive. We're really uplifting. We're always trying to be kind to each other. And a lot of times people will say that, you know, they really like something or something is really cool. And that's really all the feedback that you get, is only this positive feedback. It's never there is something you can improve, because no one really wants to hurt anyone's feelings, right, or feel like they want to be confrontational. And sometimes, especially on Twitter, it's really hard to word constructive criticism in 240 characters. So people take things the wrong way, but when someone releases something and you download it, whether or not it's free or you paid for it, you like leaving feedback for the creator is so, so important for them to improve their craft, and so important. Even if what you have to say isn't positive, you don't want to be an asshole.
Right.
But I do feel sometimes that the tabletop RPG space is too positive, that we need to be a little more critical of each other, because that's how we grow.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly fair. And I also think a lot of it stems from people not being sure how to give that criticism, or even, well, I guess there's two places that it comes from, but I'll start with this one. And it's the fact that, you know, if you want to give somebody criticism or feedback, again, constructive criticism, the way to do it is, you know, don't just point out the bad stuff. Don't be rude about it, which you mentioned as well. I always like to just start off with a compliment, put in a little bit of the, you know, what you could do better, and then end it on a separate compliment. You know, it's a feedback sandwich that you need to give somebody. And if you just come in swinging saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, it's just going to make for a very negative space.
Yeah, you give them you called it a feedback sandwich. I've always called it a shit sandwich. You put the two nice pieces of bread on the other side, and then you put the shit in the middle, and, you know, you hope that you want it to look nicer and you want to give them the compliments, but you also want to give them the feedback. And so I've been asked to review a lot of DM's Guild products, or I've asked to review DM's Guild products and been given complimentary copies to do so. And that's the approach that I always take, is that I'll say what I thought was really good about the product. Then I might say something that I think could be improved upon. And then I'll end with a wrap up, like, overall, I thought this product was really good. These were the strengths of the product, and like making sure don't end it on a negative note. Right. You want to start off with something positive, then give some good feedback, and then end with something positive. So I agree exactly with what you said.
And then the other issue that I think is definitely pretty apparent is, as you said, nobody wants to hurt any feelings. So I think sometimes people just legitimately, they look at it and they go, well, I could give a whole bunch of constructive criticism, but it would be a lot of effort to phrase that right. So I'm just going to be supportive and say, hey, you keep on going. And honestly, if that's all you've got and you don't have the energy to put into feedback, saying something positive is at the end of the day better than saying nothing. So, keep on keeping on.
Agreed. You don't want to just say something bad. Constructive feedback is work, right? That's why people are paid for developmental editors and pay for people to review their products, is because it's work. Giving good feedback is a job.
Definitely. And so to kind of segue a little bit, when you first got into homebrew, or even just now, what were some of the challenges that you faced from, I guess, going from making homebrew for your table to actually releasing it out to the world?
I'd say I had 3 big challenges. The first of which is art. And I don't really want to get into the whole controversy that I have with free products released on Reddit versus stuff on DM's Guild. But if you're a part of the homebrew community and you look at both DM's Guild stuff and Reddit stuff, you notice that there's usually a pretty big art quality gap there. And that's because the licensing for art and the commissioning of art is incredibly expensive. Right. So we as tabletop role players expect good art in our products. The reasons for that are an entirely separate conversation, but good art is expected. But good art is way more expensive than tabletop RPG product. So, as a new creator starting out, it was really hard for me to get art for my products. And that's why we see so much D&D done on Kickstarter, is because that's the only way to afford to hire good artists, is to use Kickstarter to generate enough revenue to actually be able to pay artists. So, art was definitely my first big struggle. I would say my second big struggle was editing. I am an ideas guy. I'm really good at coming up with tons of different ideas. My ADHD-fueled mind can come up with 3 different worlds in a single afternoon. I can really hyper-focus in and write a lot in a single day, but I have a really hard time with grammar and spelling. That's something I've always struggled with outside of tabletop RPG. That's something I struggled with for my entire school career. And what's important there is realizing that I should not be putting the editing burden on myself. I have done 2 different things about that. 1, I've hired editors. 2, when I've been asked to join projects, I'm like, I'm not going to edit my own work here. There needs to be an editor. You need to have an editor brought on. And even if that means I make less money, my work is going to be far superior if an editor takes a look at it. And the third thing that I've done is, especially for really small DM's Guild products that I might only charge 99 cents for or $1.95 for, I have some friends I've met on Twitter who are always willing to review the product, and then I'll make sure to give them a free copy of the product as a thank you for that. Usually that's stuff that's only like 500 to 1,000 words. Usually not a huge editing burden there. This isn't like a 50,000 word book. So that's kind of what I do there, was realizing that editing is not my responsibility and it shouldn't have to be my responsibility. And that when I make projects or create products, I should be willing to get an editor.
Definitely. Yeah, I can't think of any person who in like an actual professional setting who's like, oh yeah, I've done all of my own editing for years because I'm my best critic. No, you need somebody else to review it and to find your mistakes. Oh
yeah, 100%. And that is exactly what I said. I had a friend, Titamancy RPG on Twitter, Lex, and they literally told me that, why are you trying to do this editing yourself? That isn't how it works in other writing professions. Nobody does their own editing. And you're exactly right. So I took away that editing burden for myself. And then the final thing was presentation. And this is another thing where you've got to realize your strengths and realize how much budget do you have in your products. For stuff that I like to release on Twitter or Reddit, usually I'll create that using GM Binder. It's not too complicated, not too fancy. You can't do that much with GM Binder. It's not like something like Affinity Publisher or Photoshop where you can really create beautiful, fantastic layouts.
Right.
But it's serviceable. And understanding that for smaller releases like that, having something serviceable that looks fine is okay. Because the content is usually more important in that. But if I'm going to be releasing a really bigger product, like when I released Finding Familiar, which was a product I spent about 2 months creating, I contracted out layout. And I gave them a royalty percentage of the DM Guild product. And I had to be okay with losing that percentage because it would have taken me so much more time than it would take my layout artist to make it look professional, that it's just not worth your time. So I would stress to people getting into homebrewing, you find someone who's willing to edit your products. If you're going to be releasing stuff on DM's Guild, you can definitely find editors who will be willing to take a percentage of the royalties. If you're releasing smaller stuff, you can do your own layout if you feel comfortable, but if not, it's okay to contract out. And in terms of what I've learned about art, is that art is really, really difficult. And that creating good art is a combination of using stock art and being okay with using stock art. It's a combination of being willing to give artists a large percentage of royalties for products they've already created. If you see some art on Twitter or on Instagram, something that you really, really like, I've just messaged artists and I've told them, hey, I'd love to use your art in this product. Would you be willing to do that for, say, 5% of the royalties or 10% of the royalties? And for smaller products, I've been able to release it with really high quality art by giving up a percentage of my royalties to artists. So don't be afraid. You don't need to be getting the full royalty percentage on every product that you release. You can give out pieces, and you should, and that'll create better products.
Yeah, and I think a advantage to that may be a little more hidden is it allows you to move on to a new product. Because otherwise you're spending all of your time, let's say you're doing all of the editing. Well, now a 2-month project is taking you 3 months, and that's a month you could have spent on something new that you could be selling and you could be, moving forward on.
Yeah, and even if it's just making homebrew that you're putting on Reddit, I would really encourage you, if you're the dungeon master at your table, you've got a great source of feedback, which are your players. I've definitely asked my players at the table, hey, would you take a look at this thing that I've created? What do you think? Did I make any major errors in spelling or anything? What do you think creatively about this? And if you have people at the table that you trust to give you feedback, that can be a great source. I mean, you as the dungeon master are putting in a ton of work every week to create awesome sessions for them. So occasionally asking them to look at something and give you feedback, or you run a monster that you've just created. Asking for feedback after the session is a fantastic way to grow. Like, what did you guys think of the abilities? Did you think that you guys had agency as players? Did you guys think that there was reasonable counterplay? Like, was this type of encounter fun for you? Just asking those kind of questions after a session, great way to get feedback. You give players a cool magic item, they play with it for 3 or 4 sessions, and you say, what do you think of this magic item? Do you think it's too powerful, not powerful enough? You can learn a whole lot. Like, your table will give you feedback.
Yeah, and depending on the table, it might be good feedback, or if it's like my table, then every magic item I give them, they just say, yeah, it's not powerful enough. Make the next one stronger.
Oh, my sweet summer children.
And that's why I stopped giving them magic items.
They abused their privilege and they lost it. I unfortunately can do no such thing. I love magic items way too much, and I love creating them, and I love filling magic item shops with tons of fantastic stuff for my players. Though I did learn a lesson. I gave one of them an item that would allow them to cast Blur once a day without concentration.
Oh no.
That I gave them like legendary swords, like super special armor for every player. That was the most powerful item in the entire campaign. Big mistake. That thing should have been legendary. It was so good.
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head the specifics of Blur, and by that I mean I'm now typing it into a certain website.
It gives all attack rolls against you disadvantage.
Yeah.
And normally it requires concentration, so if an attack manages to hit you, you need to make a con save. But since I made that item not concentration, basically it was a minute where all attacks against them had disadvantage.
Yeah, that's a little strong. That's a little strong. And I think every DM will honestly learn their lesson on giving out magic items that are just too powerful. And I know I've ruined campaigns before, early on in my DMing career, where I gave an item that was just way, way too good. You know, a +3 battle axe to a barbarian, and it was like, wow, I can't challenge this party anymore. It is near impossible. And you learn to where your pitfalls will be. I think that Blur every day for free, no concentration, it's probably one of those mistakes you won't make again.
Never make that mistake again. But for DMs, the magic item system in D&D isn't particularly great. Like, the rarity scale isn't fantastic, and different items are going to have different power levels for different campaigns.
Yep.
You know, an item that gives you a permanent +1 bonus to stealth checks might not be that fantastic in a dungeon crawl, but in a, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, which is a pretty roleplay heavy campaign, might be incredible if you're doing a ton of sneaking around all the time. So magic items are contextually powerful, and what's important for learning how to balance when you're creating magic items is, I like to just kind of look at the numbers. If you're giving them an extra spell slot a day, what level spell slot are you day? If I'm giving them an item that lets them cast Shield once a day for free, how powerful is something like that on the scale of it's once per day, one effect, it only lasts for one attack or for one round. Right. That's not too powerful an item. I'd probably rank something like that around between common to uncommon, depending on the combat level of a campaign. But maybe something like a Flame Tongue Greatsword, that might be really, really powerful in a hack and slash campaign, but if you're playing something really political intrigue, the rarity goes down. So what's important is, what kind of campaign are you playing? How much combat are you playing? And trying to think mathematically about the benefit that you're giving them. Is this a once a day a reaction thing? Is it like a Misty Step once a day that's a bonus action? Is it an effect that lasts for a minute, for 10 minutes? So you can kind of think contextually in that, and when you do, that's a way to start balancing.
Right, and even using that example you gave of, shield once per day, it's like, oh, that seems so small, right? But let's say you're one of those D&D tables, like many, where you only have one combat per day, which is very, very common. It's like, well, now, realistically speaking, a lot of the attacks that are potentially going to hit this person, they always have a trump card to get out of that. So, just little things like that. Totally agree. Gotta really think about the game you're running before just saying, oh, that looks shiny, let me throw that at them.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Love that. So you mentioned the Finding Familiar release you had recently. Talk to me about that. I assume this was your most recent one, correct?
Yeah, this was pretty much my most recent release. I did it in May. It is a supplement out on DM's Guild now, and I am a huge sucker for familiars. I absolutely love it when my players have them. I think they add so much roleplay and so much dynamic movement to games, but oftentimes I see players just use their familiar as a scouting bot, and I see DMs treat familiars as personality-less servants. They treat them like scene servants, not unseen servants, scene servants.
Sure.
And my goal was to help DMs and players roleplay their familiars and to create an incentive for familiars to be more than just scouting bots, for them to have personality and growth, because our characters grow throughout our campaigns. That's the whole point of tabletop RPGs. we want our characters to grow. But the familiars, these beings that are with people through thick and thin, a cat for a level 1 wizard is the same as a cat for a level 20 wizard.
Right.
And that didn't make sense to me. So I created rules for familiar evolutions. I wanted familiars to be able to go from being this cat companion that doesn't really have any powers or any special abilities to transforming into something more formidable at the later levels. So your cat could evolve into an owl cat that has a connection to the moon and keener senses. Or you could have it go on an entirely different evolutionary tract and become a horned cat, like a minor devil that gets more powerful as things go on. And by doing that, what tables can do is they've created an incentive for familiars to be a part of roleplay so that they can evolve, and for familiars to have their own personalities and their own goals and their own ideas, because they're changing the same as your characters.
Interesting. So how did you approach that from a balance perspective? I'm a person who's all about the mechanical aspect, and everybody knows that in later levels, your spellcasters, especially for full spellcasters, get pretty out of hand in comparison to Marshall. So what was your, I guess, thought process around even just that, giving them potentially, find familiars with even more power than they currently have?
So my approach to that was I used, and it is still kind of a flawed system, the magic item rarity system. And that all of the familiars that are included in the base level spell, and then I made 3 more. I made bunny, songbird, and dog. And those are common level familiars.
Okay.
Those are familiars you get at level 1. And then I created a scale system where each time the familiar evolves, it could either transform in its form. So, for example, the dog could become a pufferfish. And then from that point, the pufferfish could gain new abilities each time it evolves. And each time it evolves, it goes up a rarity. So for a DM, you should consider, if you're evolving the familiar, what you're doing is essentially giving the player an uncommon magic item.
Okay,
so
that makes sense.
What I did, and how I tried to tell DMs to balance it, is you give this to your wizard instead of giving them a magic item.
Right.
Or they have this really amazing roleplay moment, and this is a reward for them for their familiar's roleplay. Or they complete a small side quest, and because of that, their familiar evolves. So treat them like you treat magic items, and then I balance the abilities along that scale. So once they got to legendary level power, these familiars were able to maybe cast 2 or 3 spells a day. They had some pretty decently powerful abilities. They gained more hit points. And that was kind of how I approached that, is treat them like you would magic items. Don't just evolve someone's familiar willy-nilly, but if everybody, the wizard goes into the shop and there's a couple of magic items, maybe one of the magic items could be like a trigger for your familiar's evolution.
Sure. No, I like that approach a lot. And I definitely agree. Say we have a character right now in my home game who has an owl. And the owl's been brought up, they've been mentioned, but, they're now about level, I think, 13. I can't even remember. But regardless, they're getting up there in levels, and the familiar is basically used for scouting and is used for getting sneak attack from the rogue, because that's a thing with the owls, getting flyby. But beyond that, I wouldn't say that it has much of a personality, and due to its extremely fragile state of an owl having 10 AC and 1 HP, it's just not feasible to use it in combat in any more creative ways. So I definitely like that approach. This current campaign's kind of coming to a close, and it might be a bit forced to be like, hey, give your owl a personality. But that's something I'll definitely keep in mind for future games here.
Yeah, it's been really successful with my players. They've really enjoyed it, and the feedback on the Finding Familiar supplement has been really positive. Players have really liked the flexibility that it gives them, and DMs have loved the ability to use it as an additional reward for players.
Right. It's reminding me of, I'm playing a lot of Mass Effect right now, and I'm a sucker for Fallout New Vegas specifically. But there's often the side quests for your companions in those types of games, and afterwards, what's the reward? The companion gets a new ability. So that's just like a perfect setup for this type of idea. You know, the familiar has a problem, and once you solve it, great, now the familiar is a little bit more powerful.
Yeah, I've loved it. It was a really fun supplement to write. The art in it is absolutely adorable, and you can check it out on DM's Guild. I've really, really liked it. It's been an amazing supplement.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to have a link for that in the description if you're interested. And to talk now about future stuff, as I understand, you've got a Kickstarter that you're putting together. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, it comes out July 19th. So probably about a week after this episode airs, my Kickstarter is coming to fruition. This has been a project that's been months in development, and it is called Professor Gilroy's Guide to Fae. It's a collection of 50 creatures inspired by Celtic and Slavic mythology, all ready for 5th edition. And my goal in this is, I'm never not DM. I'm always the DM. I know the struggles of preparing session and the pains that we as DMs go to make great sessions for our players. And so my goal in this supplement is, it's not just stat block art and a little bit of lore. Every single creature is going to have monster tactics and 6 encounter hooks, so that you can slot these creatures easily into campaigns and have some advice from someone who's run them before, who knows, what is their tactics going to be like, so that you're not going to be struggling so much in combat. So if you just flip open the book and you're like, okay, it's time for a random Fae encounter in the woods, you're like, not having to struggle about monster tactics, and you can make your encounters a lot more challenging by implementing some of those. So my goal with this supplement is less work for DMs, lots of beautiful art for you to look at, and inspiring lore created and taken from true mythology.
Yeah, that's neat. So it's kind of like you're taking the monster manual and the monsters know what they're doing book and combining them into one.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to be as detailed as the monsters know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's like 5 pages on each monster. That's would be absurd in this.
No, but there is definitely going to be a lot of great lore, and in the encounter hooks, I personally find incredibly fun to write because they've inspired me in my own campaigns. Right. As I've literally been writing these encounter hooks, I'm like, wow, that's something I want to use in my campaign. And they can just be a sentence or two, but they can really help grease those creative juices, move through that DM's block that we all experience. So that's my goal, is that this supplement is more than just monsters. And that's kind of also my approach to monster creation. A lot of the creatures that will be in Professor Gilroy's Guide aren't necessarily creatures that your players might want to fight. They might be quest givers or allies or valued friends. That these Fae creatures are more than just something to be slaughtered. They're something that have personality for the most part, and intelligence, and can be played with a different kind of dynamism than something like a chittering horror or a gibbermouth or a gibbering mouther. So that's kind of my approach with this, is that the whole goal of this supplement is to make something that's more than just monsters. Creatures that are more than just something for your players to slaughter, and content that is more than just your basic stat block, 1 piece of art, and 2 paragraphs of lore.
Yeah, and that's great. So I definitely think one of when I can tell I see a stat block that is going to bore me is when it's just, I don't know, we'll say a lot of hit points and, a bite and a claw attack, and then a paragraph or 2 of lore, and you're like, really? That's what we're making these days? Which, I mean, you see it, I'll actually say that official material is more of a example of this than most creators. But it sounds like you're definitely going away from that mentality on the opposite end of the spectrum entirely, and that's awesome.
Yeah, and that's something I want to stress to DMs. This is not just even about my product as a whole, but something that I feel like we make the mistake a lot of is that we throw these giant hit point soaking machines at our players. And frankly, hitting the thing over and over again isn't incredibly interesting. You want creatures with dynamic abilities that change the battlefield. And one of my goals with the supplement is I'll have like CR5 creatures that have legendary actions or layer actions or regional effects.
Sure.
Right? Things that create a lot more dynamism in dynamic play. Lots of movement around the map. Like, I love effects that pick players up and chuck them away from the battlefield. Even if it's just 30 feet or 60 feet. I love effects that suddenly the ground amongst you begins to shake and everybody needs to make a dex save to avoid falling prone. Or things that maybe different kinds of charms and dances that, for example, a Vila in the lore that I've written in the stat block I've created for the Vila creature, which is a type of nature fae from Slavic mythology, when they begin their dance, all of the creatures that can see them within like 120 feet need to make a save or they're incapacitated and can only stare at the Vila, but they can be roused from their incapacitated state. So you have 5 players and 4 of them get stunned. Suddenly, one of those players has to run around and try to free the others while perhaps another Fey monster closes in. That's a lot more dynamic a battle situation than if I just made them fight a dire wolf. Right?
Exactly.
Having that dire wolf attack while the players are charmed by the Vila is suddenly a lot more dynamic.
Right. Now you have the player questioning. This is what I'll say. If you get to the point that the entire table has to stop and say, what the heck do we do next? And they're not just saying, I attack, I attack, I attack. That's how you know you've made a good fight. And I know people will often say like, oh, well, if you don't know what you're going to do by the time your turn comes around, we'll skip you or whatever, got to keep combat moving fast. And just, we'll say to everybody, keep what you just said in mind, Ben, that it's about creating this dynamic and memorable fight. And if you're keeping things dynamic, that means you might need to pause and think about it, because maybe that person decides, I'm going to throw Fireball at our feet, because that's going to get everybody with one action and do a little bit of damage, instead of, trying to rouse them with my whole action and just, get one person at a time. Oh, yeah.
Definitely reward your players for creative thinking. Like, if they're thinking some, like, really off-the-wall stuff, don't let them go too far, but you want to reward your players for creative thinking. And you want to create situations where creative thinking is going to be rewarded. And I can promise you can do this with 3 or 4 wolves, right? It doesn't have to be fancy monsters all of the time, but the wolves, I consider the wolf stat block is actually the example of a really, really cool stat block. These creatures have pack tactics, so they've got an incentive. You've got a kind of idea of how you want to play them. They want to attack in groups on a single target to all get advantage. And then their bite attacks pull people to the ground. So they're putting people prone, and then they can bite onto them. So if they're prone, that makes them easier to grapple. So one thing that I like to do with my wolves is one of them will pull the person to the ground, and then another wolf will grapple and start dragging them away from the rest of the party. And so then while the rest of the party might be fighting 2 wolves on the other flank, one of their players, like maybe the wizard or the cleric, is literally getting dragged away by wolves. So suddenly they have to decide, oh crap, do we need to take the opportunity attacks and run to the wizard? Do we need to fight the wolves here? Can they handle themselves? And creating that tension in your players' minds that, oh shit, I don't know what to do, and it's not just because I don't read my spells.
Right.
That is dynamic, and I want to create monsters in Professor Gilroy's Guide and in all of my content that encourage that kind of gameplay, that force players to make interesting, repeatable choices.
Love it. And that's just so everybody knows before I segue out of it. When does that Kickstarter go again, and where can people find more info about it?
So that Kickstarter is releasing July 19th is going to be the first day. You can follow the project right now on Kickstarter. You can go to Kickstarter, kickstarter.com/Professor Gilroy's/Guide to Fae, and you can find that Kickstarter right now and follow the project so you can be alerted the instant it goes live. If not, you can check it out on July 19th, or you can follow me on Twitter. We have an amazing trailer video that was put together by actually an Emmy-nominated video editor, and we absolutely love it. Steve Pentokai did an amazing job on our trailer video. So if you follow me on Twitter, you can check out my pinned tweet, and the trailer video is right there. And you can learn more about Professor Gilroy's guide.
Man, you really went all out on this. This sounds really awesome.
I'm really excited to release this product. It's got beautiful art. I love the artist that I'm working with. And something different that we're doing is it's field guide style art. Black and white sketchbook style. Which gives it a very Arthur Spiderwick Chronicles feel to it, a very organic feel. The book is actually, unlike a lot of other monster manuals from third parties like Kobold Press or from official products, it's actually written from the perspective of Professor Gilroy. Okay. So it's a little more first person, a little more personable. It's like he's actually, the goal is that reading the book is like listening to Professor Gilroy lecture. And he's this dynamic, ridiculous personality.
That sounds great. And before we then transition to the end of this, because we are around the hour mark, I do like to kind of turn things over just to make sure that we haven't missed anything. Is there anything on your mind that you want to talk about? Can be related to products you've made, or it can be totally off the walls. Doesn't even have to be D&D related if you don't want it to be.
For everyone who's out there thinking about, oh my gosh, I want to make a Kickstarter. Oh my gosh, I want to make DM's Guild products. I want to create things. And you're wondering where to start. Even if it's something like you want to create your own homebrewed world. For me, almost every single idea starts with a single phrase. So when I created the world of Syndra, my phrase was the 7 swords of Syndra. Why are there... And then you ask yourself questions. Why are there 7 swords? Well, there's 7 gods. What are they the gods of? Okay? What kind of world would have these gods in them? It's a world that cares a lot about destiny. What does a world that cares a lot about destiny look like? And if you just keep asking yourself questions, you can create some absolutely amazing products. So, one thing that I do when I want to create a subclass, I think of names. Circle of Storms. Okay, so we've got a Storm-based druid. What do I want a storm-based druid to feel like? Chaotic, powerful, flying. And then I base my mechanics around that. You don't always have to start in this deep mechanical pit. For me, it just starts with a name, with a phrase. Professor Gilroy's guy started out with the phrase, the Song of the Sea. And I thought that was a really cool thing for a Selkie to sing. And I was like, wow, I want to make a product with Selkies in it. Well, Selkies are from Celtic mythology. And then I started doing a huge deep dive into research because I was asking myself, well, what other cool creatures are there in Celtic mythology that I might never have heard of before? And I just went into a deep dive on that. So if you don't know where to start, or with a mechanic, with a homebrewed world, with a product that you want to release, or an idea that you have, just think of phrases that get stuck in your head. Cool sounding words that you hear people say. And for me, that's where it all starts.
That's great advice. I like that idea. Just, keep asking yourself questions. Be inquisitive towards yourself and just allow that to keep branching out and see where it takes you.
Yeah. And never be afraid to promote yourself. Never be afraid to promote yourself. Because if you don't promote yourself, nobody else will.
Right. And earlier when you said a circle of storms, I thought you said a circle of thorns, like Thorns. And now I'm really thinking about a druid that leans heavily into the battlefield control aspects. So If you could go ahead and get on that and make a Circle of Thorns, let me know.
I can do that. I can do that.
That's what you're here for, right? It's for me to make requests. I'm just going to throw subclasses at you, and I expect them in a month. Does that sound good?
Yeah, we'll do it.
Perfect. All right. Well, that just about does it for our time. Ben, thank you so much for coming on. This was a blast, and it was great to prick your brain. That's not the right word. Just a nice little stab. Pick your brain, which is also a little bit violent, I guess. But thank you so much for hopping on and sharing some wisdom and talking. I think what will help a lot of people here is answering the question of how to get into homebrewing in the first place.
Remember, you don't have to do it all on your own, and you shouldn't be doing it all on your own. But it's been a real pleasure. I was happy to have my brain stacked by you.
Wonderful. So make sure to check out Ben's Kickstarter. Find him on Twitter at NeverNotDM. There will be links where I always put the links depending on where you're watching or listening. So don't worry, there's links. And as always, goodbye and thanks for listening.
Thank you all so much.